Welcome back to a brand new video, folks. Today we are going to look at the Unhallowed Essence Multishot Strafe build for Season 27. In order to find out if this is a good build for you, let's go ahead and dive into some of the pros and cons. To get started with the pros, this build is very easy to play. It also has great mobility. In addition to that, you've also got wonderfully fast movement speed. Sometimes it can be even a little hard to control. The build is also very aesthetically satisfying. You'll see that later when we dive into a rift, but you are firing multi-shots all the way across the screen and it looks absolutely insane. In addition to the build looking very aesthetically pleasing, you're also going to notice that you clear entire screens of monsters very quickly. And to round out the pros, it is a very evasive build. You get to spam the smokescreen ability very quickly, and you are very often not going to be taking damage because of this. One more pro that I should have mentioned is that it's a very good T16 build for bounties, for keys, and anything else that you're looking to do in Torment 16 or lower greater rifts. To get into the cons, this build is not great at all for pushing high greater rifts. It's not the worst build in the game, but it is very outclassed by other Demon Hunter builds this season. Although the build is very evasive, you are pretty squishy and you can die fairly easily. To add to that, this build is not particularly desired in group metas. You're going to be playing solo a lot with this build, or kind of casual content with friends. And lastly, this one's not huge, but the hatred management can be a little annoying. So I do make my build in a very specific way to kind of get around that to some extent. Okay, let's dive into the gear. To get started, we're going to be using the full 6-piece set of Unhallowed Essence. We are not using a Ring of Royal Grandeur for this particular variant of the build, and so you will need all 6 pieces to actually get this to function. For our rings and amulets, we're going to be using a Focus and Restraint combo, and then we are also going to be using the Squirt's Necklace to deal out some pretty crazy damage. You should not be taking damage very often with this build, so it is pretty easy to keep up the Squirt's buff. We're also going to use the Warzeshian arm guards because they are going to help us move much quicker, and we also use the Krelm's belt so that we can move faster. These two together will give you a lot of movement speed. For the bow, we're going to be using a Yang's. If you do not have a Primal Yang's or a very highly rolled Ancient Yang's, I would really recommend using your Angelic Crucible in this bow. Make sure that when you roll it with the Angelic Crucible that you are getting the ability for Strafe to cast the last non-channeled hatred spending ability. To round out the gear, we're also going to be using a Dead Man's Legacy so that we get additional multi-shot damage. Okay, to talk a little bit about stat priority, let's start with the helm. You're going to want dexterity, you're going to want crit hit chance, and you're going to want multi-shot damage. The higher you can roll these, the better. I don't have great rolls, and I also do not have an ancient, so I am unable to augment it. Next up are the shoulders. These are going to be the stats that you want as well. You want that dexterity, vitality, resource cost reduction, and cooldown reduction. As mentioned earlier, we are using a Squirt's Necklace. I do not have the perfect rolls on this. You are going to want the crit hit chance, crit hit damage, the socket, and you're also going to want fire damage percent. I will admit it is a little hard to roll a Squirt's that is a quadfecta, so getting dexterity initially instead of fire damage is fine, but really make sure that you've got the 2 crits and you've got the socket. Let's talk about the gloves. These are kind of the stats that you want. However, I would say that if you could roll off that vitality and get resource cost reduction, it might be a little easier to play, especially when it comes to managing that hatred. So the chest is a really important piece to talk about for this build. You'll notice that I re-rolled the secondary stat to make sure that I got max discipline. You're going to want the dexterity, vitality, and all resist, but the discipline is absolutely essential. This build benefits in a huge way based on how much discipline you have in your pool. For the wrists, you're going to want these stats. You're going to want the fire damage, dexterity, vitality, and crit hit chance. For the belt, as we had gone over earlier, we are using the Krelms. These are the stats that you're going to want on it. You want that dexterity, vitality, all resist, and life percent. Alright, for the Focus and Restraint combo, you're going to want the same stats on them effectively. So you're going to want, ideally, average damage over dexterity, and then you're going to want the crit hit chance, crit hit damage, and socket for both of these. One thing that I will say is that there is a variant of this build that opts to use the Stone of Jordan and Elusive Ring instead of the Focus and Restraint combo. The Stone of Jordan works really well for this build. It's going to be able to give you fire damage and discipline. Of course, the Stone of Jordan also has 30% increased damage against elites on it as well. These are very helpful stats. I wouldn't say that I like them more than the crit hit chance and crit hit damage. However, the addition of plus 10 discipline on that ring is massive. As we had mentioned earlier, for some of the cons of this build is that it is squishy. So the Elusive Ring is also a very good ring to use for this build. You can absolutely go either which way. Personally, I opt to go with the Focus and Restraint combo just because I can clear higher level content with this, and I feel like the build is plenty strong enough to not really need to use those rings. However, if you are dying a lot, I would really recommend going with the Stone of Jordan Elusive Ring combo. Okay, for the pants, these are not quite the ideal rolls, but you are going to want that dexterity, the vitality, and instead of armor, you would ideally want to get all resist here. Next up are the boots. These are the ideal stats that you're going to want: dexterity, vitality, all resist, and percent damage on multi-shot. For your bow, Yang's recurve is absolutely essential for this build. You need that 50% resource cost reduction, and it's also going to increase the damage of your multi-shot by a pretty significant amount. Personally, I like the stats that I have rolled on this. However, what I will say is that you can roll off the vitality to actually get more resource cost reduction. As you can see here, we're now at the Mystic, and if you look at vitality here, I have the opportunity to roll additional resource cost reduction. There is a diminishing return to this, however, so it is worth noting that you're not really going to get a full 10%. The very last thing to note about the Yangs is that you'll notice that it can also roll maximum discipline. You're absolutely going to need that roll. And for the last piece, the offhand, as we had gone over earlier, we're using the Dead Man's Legacy. I will admit that the stats on mine are absolutely atrocious. The only reason I'm using it is because it gets the 197% multi-shot boost. Okay, so instead of vitality on this, you'd much rather have increased percent multi-shot damage. Instead of percent life, you're going to want cooldown reduction. Otherwise, the dexterity, the crit hit chance, and the attack speed are the correct rolls for this piece. You'll also notice that this piece also requires plus 12 to max discipline on it. One thing that I will say is this is a difficult piece to roll well. You need a lot of things to go correctly for you because in addition to the max discipline, you're also going to need a really high percent for your multi-shot boost. The bonus goes up to 200%, so the closer you can get to that, the better. If you happen to get a Primal Yangs that rolls well, or a really solid Ancient Yangs, you may want to consider using your Angelic Crucible on the Dead Man's Legacy instead, just to make sure that you are getting the most additional plus damage percent for multi-shot. So let's move in to the legendary gems that we're going to use for this build. When you're doing Torment 16, I would recommend a Boon of the Hoarder, or if you're doing higher level content, I would recommend using Zaystone of Vengeance over this. We're also going to be using the Taeguk. This is because we are channeling Strafe all the time, and so we will always be able to keep up 10 stacks of Taeguk. This is going to increase our damage and our survivability. As you probably could have guessed, we're going to be using a Bane of the Trapped in our last legendary gem slot. Bane of the Trapped just adds significant damage to your character and is used very commonly in a huge number of builds. Alright, let's take a look at the cube here. We're going to be using an Echoing Fury. If you do not know, what it means to go into Frenzy mode is that you're going to gain increased attack speed and movement speed. This effect can stack up to 5 times. You can get up to 75% increased attack speed and 25% increased movement speed. This effect is basically going to be up on our character at all times when we are engaged in any type of combat. Okay, moving on to the armor piece, we're going to be using a Pride's Fall. This primarily drops out of bounty bags for Act 3. They also have a chance to drop out of bounty bags for Act 4, but are going to be more common from Act 3. Resource cost reduction is very important for this build, especially because we need to keep a very high amount of discipline in our pool. If we are losing discipline with this build, we're going to be doing substantially less damage for basically every single point of discipline. If we look here at the 6-piece set bonus, Each point of discipline is giving us 350% increased damage, so even dropping a little bit from your pool is going to notably reduce your damage. Between the Pride's Fall and the Yang's Recurve, we have so much resource cost reduction that the discipline pool is effectively not moving even when I'm spamming smokescreen right now. Okay, lastly, we're going to be using the Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac. We do not use a Dawn with this build, and so we want to keep permanent uptime on our Vengeance. So this is how we do that. Not having permanent uptime on Vengeance is going to make you incredibly squishy. Alright, to get into the skills, I'm going to be using Evasive Fire with the Cold Rune so that I'm generating more hatred each time I shoot. Now, there is a variant of this build, the one that we were talking about earlier, that's going to use the Stone of Jordan in the Elusive Ring. If you are playing that variant, you do not need a generator, so I would recommend taking Shadow Power instead of a generator like Evasive Fire if you're using those rings. But because we are using the Focus and Restraint combo, I do want to have a generator, and I also feel like it helps a lot with managing my hatred. Okay, so the next skill is kind of the whole purpose of the build. This is going to allow us to shoot multi-shots at a crazy rate that automatically aim at the targets. We're going to take the Drifting Shadow rune because this is going to increase our movement speed. Okay, so we're going to be using multi-shot with Arsenal. The nice thing about this is that you only have to fire it once at the start of a rift. Beyond that, the strafe ability is going to be constantly shooting it out for you at a much faster rate than you could shoot multi-shots yourself. So I recommend taking Smokescreen with Displacement. There is an alternative to that, however. If you are for some reason struggling with your discipline management because maybe your build is not optimized yet, I would recommend taking Special Recipe as opposed to Displacement just to reduce the discipline cost because you really need to make sure that you are keeping your discipline up at all times. Next up is Preparation with Invigoration. This is absolutely essential. If I'm being completely honest, I really never use this ability and I only take it for the passive with the rune to permanently increase our maximum discipline by 20. Because of our 6-piece set bonus, the 20 additional discipline is a 7,000% damage increase, so you absolutely need to take this skill. Lastly, we're going to be taking Vengeance with Darkheart. This is going to keep you alive. You get 50% damage reduction while you have this up. It is mandatory for this build, and because we're using that Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac, so long as you're staying engaged in combat, you can have this up permanently. For the passives, we're primarily going to be taking things that help us move faster. So we're going to take the Tactical Advantage. Each time that we are casting our smokescreen, we're going to gain movement speed. Next up is Hot Pursuit. You hit an enemy, you gain 20% increased movement speed. This is great for getting through content very quickly. We're also going to be taking Ambush. This is what's going to allow us, to some extent, to clear an entire screen instantly. Our first shot on them is going to deal substantial damage, especially in Torment 16. Now this last one is a little debatable. I like to use the Night Stalker because I'm using the Focus Restraint combo with a Generator skill. This helps me manage my hatred really well. Each time as I'm rolling along and I'm strafing, I'm just making sure to shoot an Evasive Fire every few seconds just to make sure that my hatred is staying up, and we've got our Focus procced. For the follower, I'm using my Enchantress just to gain some additional cooldown reduction. Just make sure with your follow that you're putting on as much emanating gear as possible, like the Flavor of Time and any other piece that emanates the abilities to your character. I also recommend that you put an Avarice Band and a Ring of Royal Grandeur on your follower, and also be using 2 pieces of the Sage's set and 2 pieces of the Cane set. So putting the Cane set on your follower is actually going to emanate to you, to some extent, the experience percent gained. So with the Cane set, it gives a 50% increased experience bonus, and that is going to give 20% of that to you. So ultimately, it's going to lead you to get 10% increased experience whenever you're clearing content. In addition, when using the Cane set, whenever a Greater Rift Keystone drops, there's a 20% chance that an additional one will drop. This is really good if you're using this character to key farm. And the Sage's set, by using 2 pieces of that, you're just going to get more Death's Breaths. Whenever they drop, an additional one is going to drop. Lastly, I'd really recommend putting Nemesis Bracers on your follower so that each time you hit a shrine or pylon, an elite is also spawning on top of it. Although I wouldn't highly recommend it if you are interested in pushing with this build, I would recommend getting Captain Crimson's. Make sure you're using a Ring of Royal Grandeur so that you can still get the 6-piece set bonus, and I would also recommend using Wraps of Clarity over these arm guards. Alright, to round out this video, let's go ahead and get into a T16 Rift and just show off how fast this build moves and how satisfying it is to play. Alrighty folks, I really appreciate you for dropping in for another video. I hope that you really like this build and that it works out well for you. Go ahead and drop a comment down below and let me know what you think of this build. I hope that you're all having a great Season 27. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.